Billionaire pretends to sleep to test his maid's son. What he heard left his face went pale. Will Hawthorne looked as though he were merely asleep. His eyes were shut tight, his breathing slow and steady. His tall frame sunk deep into the dark brown leather armchair imported from Italy that sat squarely in the middle of a stately library paneled floor to ceiling in polished oak. To the casual observer, he might have seemed like nothing more than a weary middle-aged man dozing off on a heavy, rain-soaked afternoon in the quiet suburbs of Savannah, Georgia. But behind those closed lids, Will was fully awake. He was not drifting into dreams. Quite the opposite. He was listening, calculating, waiting. At the age of 48, Will was far from an old man, yet his soul felt ancient, worn thin by years of betrayal. He had once founded and sold one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the American South. There had been a time when he had it all: money, prestige, a stunning home, and a wife he had believed was the love of his life. But after a brutal divorce, all that remained was mistrust and cold silence. The woman who once claimed to love him for his ideals and character had taken nearly 70% of his wealth through a series of legal yet merciless maneuvers. Business associates had turned their backs on him. Shareholders had smirked at his downfall. Family members had gone quiet, each slipping away down their own path. In the aftermath, Will withdrew from the public eye, sold off what remained of the company, and moved into the old family estate in Savannah, where he now lived in near isolation. The library where he sat was the only place that still held any warmth for him, not because of the glowing coal fire, but because it reminded him of his late father, the only man who had ever taught him that honor mattered more than wealth. But Will no longer believed in honor. He no longer believed in love or kindness. In his view, given the chance to take something without being caught, every person, whether rich or poor, would do so. Today, Will intended to test that belief once again. He didn't have to. He wasn't hurting for money. He had nothing left to prove. And yet something restless within him demanded clarity, demanded confirmation that he had not misjudged the world, that everything he had come to believe in the wake of his deepest wounds was still true. On the small table beside his chair, a thick envelope had been placed with deliberate care. Inside was $5,000 in crisp $100 bills stacked neatly but exposed just enough to appear forgotten. No locks, no covers, nothing to conceal it. A silent invitation. Today was the first day on the job for a new housekeeper, a single mother named Rachel Myers. She had asked permission to bring her young son along as the school had closed unexpectedly. Will had agreed, at least on the surface. In truth, he had planned for this. A simple scenario: one room, one child, an exposed sum of money, and one man pretending to sleep. He wanted to see in this world shaped by self-interest whether honesty could still survive, or whether everyone was simply waiting for the right moment to take what was never theirs. Rain continued to drum its steady rhythm against the tall window panes. The fire snapped softly in the hearth, sending waves of warmth into the cool air. And Will, with eyes still shut and breath still even, kept every sense sharp and taut, ready to absorb whatever truth would come. He did not hope for goodness. He only sought to prove that his belief, forged in pain, still held true. That was why he remained there, motionless as stone, waiting for the door to open, waiting for the soft footsteps to cross the threshold, waiting to see if the story in his mind was destined to repeat itself once more. The story has only just begun, but can you feel it too? That quiet stirring beneath the calm surface, like something unseen beginning to shift. If you're drawn in, if something about this moment resonates deep within, then consider subscribing to Emotional Echoes today, so you won't miss a single heartfelt, honest, and soul-stirring story we share each day. These are stories told with care and sincerity, crafted for those who still believe in the quiet strength of kindness, in the fragile beauty of trust, and in the deep human need for empathy. If what you're hearing feels worthy of being shared, don't forget to tap like and pass it along. And where are you listening from? Leave a comment with your city, state, or country. Let us know where in the world this story found your heart. Thank you for being here. And now let's return to the story. The room remained utterly still, like a stage carefully set for a play whose first act was moments from unfolding. Will Hawthorne sat motionless, his eyes still shut, but every muscle in his face and body was drawn tight like the string of a bow pulled to its limit, waiting for the exact second to release. Inside his mind, the past returned in sharp, unforgiving clarity, as vivid as if it had happened only yesterday. He remembered the day he walked out of the courthouse, nearly 2 years lost to a divorce that drained not just time but pieces of his very being. Amanda, the woman he had once loved and trusted without question, had taken more than the bulk of his fortune. She had taken his name, his standing, the career he had spent close to 2 decades building from the ground up. With perfectly timed tears and honeyed words, she had turned the media to her side. The headlines had called him controlling, obsessed with power, a broken man isolated by his own coldness. But Will knew the truth. The truth was he had been deceived. Not once but over and over, month after month, by the one person he believed would walk beside him for life. The deepest pain wasn't in the loss of money, it was in the crumbling of trust. After the divorce, Will withdrew from the world. He severed ties with most friends, sold his remaining shares in the company, and purchased the old family estate in Savannah, turning it into a lonely fortress where he could feel safe in solitude. The people who worked in the house were all temporary contract staff, none close enough to be called by name. He didn't want closeness anymore. Will began living by a system of vigilance. Doors were double-locked, assets spread across multiple locations, hidden cameras in nearly every room, but deep beneath those layers of protection a question lingered like smoke that wouldn't clear. Were all people untrustworthy, or had he simply met the wrong ones? That thought clung to him, especially on rainy nights like this one, when the wind scraped against the eaves and made the vast house feel even colder. Then, 3 days ago, when the elderly housekeeper requested medical leave and suggested a temporary replacement named Rachel Myers, a quiet idea took root in Will's mind. Rachel was a single mother. Her background check came back spotless, too spotless. A widow, a young child, income well below the poverty line, no family support. Will had heard hundreds of stories just like hers, and many of them ended in theft, or at the very least with a few valuable items vanishing without a trace. So when Rachel asked to bring her son along due to an unexpected school closure, Will didn't hesitate. He agreed at once. It was the perfect setup: a 7-year-old child, a room filled with expensive objects, and an envelope left conspicuously unattended on a table. How long would it take for human instinct to surface? Will had privately instructed his head of security to disable the camera in the library for exactly 30 minutes. He didn't want to witness this through a screen or a lens. He wanted to see it himself. Just him, the boy, and the truth. The envelope had been prepared that very morning. $5,000 in crisp, newly printed $100 bills, stacked neatly in a cream-colored envelope with a subtle gold trim, the kind used to hand over contracts in high-level meetings. He placed it at a slight angle on the table beside his chair, no more than the length of his forearm away. One edge of the bills peeked out from the flap as if someone had just used it and forgotten to put it away. The room had been cleared of distractions, save for the chair he now sat in and the table beside it. One window, left slightly ajar, let the sound of rain thread into the air. The fire still burned, but its warmth wasn't enough to chase off the chill that slipped through the cracks. The entire scene had been arranged like a trap, a perfect trap. No words, no questions, only actions would speak. Will shifted slightly, tilting his head to the left to ease the strain in his neck from holding so still. He drew in a deep, even breath and let it out slowly, continuing the rhythm of sleep he had so carefully rehearsed. Then, from the other side of the door, he heard it. The soft click of the doorknob turning. Light footsteps began to approach. The scene was set. The test subject had entered, and the truth, whatever shape it would take, was only a few heartbeats away. The quiet click of the doorknob stirred something deep within Will Hawthorne, unraveling the layers of memory he had spent years trying to bury. He held his pose, the illusion of sleep undisturbed, but his mind slipped backward, pulled into a time when everything had seemed untouched, golden, almost too good to question. He was young then, driven by vision, bursting with belief in the future and in love itself. He had met Amanda at a technology conference in Atlanta. She was sharp, magnetic, and had a way of smiling that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. Back then he had trusted that smile, believed every soft-spoken word she whispered before his key presentations, believed that after years of building his company from the shell of his father's old garage, he had finally found someone worthy to walk beside him. But just a few years later, the very things he had believed in became blades driven straight into his core. The divorce had begun with the smallest suspicions. A few calls Amanda had tried to hide, meetings she'd brushed off as work. Until the day he discovered she had signed a financial consulting contract with a rival firm, carrying with her the confidential strategies that were the beating heart of his business. Worse still, she had used those very documents against him in court. The proceedings dragged on, and her attorneys painted a version of Will Hawthorne that barely resembled the man he knew himself to be: greedy, controlling, cold, a husband who hoarded success and left nothing for the woman by his side. The media followed closely, feeding the public a daily dose of scandal, turning him into a symbol of failure in the Southern tech world. Business partners disappeared, each quietly distancing themselves from the wreckage. Those he once thought of as allies revealed their true allegiance not to friendship but to advantage. What hurt most was how Amanda managed to seem so fragile, so wounded each time she took the stand. She spoke of all she had given up to be the wife of a man like Will. And with every tear she shed, the weight of public opinion turned against him like a wave of cold sea crashing over his name. He remembered vividly the afternoon the judge delivered the final ruling. Amanda was granted the majority of their shared assets, full rights to the main house in Atlanta, and long-term financial support. Will stood there, packed into a courtroom, thick with tension, and felt as though he had lost his entire life. The money was never the real loss. What was truly gone was his faith in people, in love, and the idea that integrity mattered. When he walked out of that courthouse, there was no one waiting, no words of comfort, no hand reaching to steady him at the edge of that emotional cliff. The world kept moving as if nothing had happened. He stood alone in the harsh midday sun of Georgia, but felt no warmth. From that day on, Will carried a pain that had no language, a wound that would never scar over because it wasn't of the body but of trust. He stopped believing in promises, in kindness, in the idea that anyone ever acted out of goodness rather than gain. He moved to Savannah to start again, though in truth he was hiding. The old family estate became his fortress against the past. Its walls held generations of memory, but they also held the silence he had chosen, the kind of silence that protects as much as it punishes. As the soft patter of small footsteps drew nearer to the library door, Will realized that old wound remained untouched, as raw as it had ever been. And perhaps that was why he had set this trap. He needed proof that the world still worked the way he believed it did. He needed to know he wasn't wrong to live apart from it all. But in that very moment, as the breath of a child approached and the air shifted with the weight of possibility, Will had no way of knowing that the world was about to hand him a different kind of answer, one he had never prepared himself to face. The door eased open with a quiet creak, the hinges whispering into the stillness like a breath held too long. Will didn't move. His eyes remained shut, his breathing calm and even, the illusion of sleep perfectly intact. But inside him, every sense was sharply tuned, braced for the slightest tremor. Soft-soled shoes brushed the wooden floor with careful, measured steps. A woman's voice murmured so soft it was almost silence. She was trying not to disturb him. Will heard the hesitant breath of a child, smaller, lighter, laced with uncertainty. Rachel Myers had entered, bringing her 7-year-old son with her. He didn't need to open his eyes to see them. The details from her file were already etched in his mind. A 33-year-old widow, no assets, no credit issues, employed part-time with no close family. Everything about her was clean, almost suspiciously, so the kind of clean that made complete trust feel dangerous. She had been hired just 3 days ago on the recommendation of Mrs. Higgins, his longtime housekeeper, now on medical leave. Rachel didn't wear a uniform. She stepped into the room in a cream-colored coat, its sleeves faintly frayed at the wrists. Her hair was pulled back neat and simple, revealing a face that bore the shadows of sleepless nights. She wore no makeup yet. Something gentle remained in her features, a beauty not of polish but of endurance. But it wasn't her appearance that caught Will's attention. It was the way she moved. Her steps were deliberate, reverent, as if every inch of this room was sacred and fragile, as if one wrong motion might shatter it. Her eyes stayed low, fixed on the carpet, never daring to rise toward the man sleeping in the leather armchair. The boy beside her was small and thin, swallowed slightly by a navy sweater, too big for his frame, and scuffed sneakers worn bare at the toes. He clung to her side, his wide eyes scanning the room not with curiosity but with wariness. Will heard Rachel lean down and whisper to her son. Her voice trembled not out of weakness but from tension she was trying hard to restrain. She told him not to move, not to touch anything, not to make a sound. that if he woke the man in the chair, she would lose her job, and Will could hear it. She wasn't scolding, she wasn't exaggerating, she was afraid. The kind of fear that lives in someone who has already lost too much, who knows just how sharp the drop can be after one wrong step. He heard the boy respond with a soft nod and a quiet voice. There was no argument, no complaint, just two small words spoken with obedient clarity. "Yes, Mom." Rachel stepped back out, closing the door with a care that made it barely audible. Now Will was alone with the child in the vast, hushed library. Still feigning sleep, he felt something strange stir inside him, a curiosity that had no name. It wasn't the boy himself that drew Will's attention. It was the complete absence of anything familiar. This child was not like those he had seen at business galas or distant family barbecues. He didn't fidget. He didn't stare in wonder at the gleaming wood shelves or the crackling fire. There was no mischief in his gaze, no arrogance, no restlessness, just silence. A kind of watchful silence that didn't belong to children, but to adults who had learned too early how the world could wound. Will listened. Nothing. No footsteps, no sound of movement, no rustling envelope. The boy was sitting still. It defied everything Will had predicted. Children, especially those raised with less, tended to explore, to test boundaries, to reach for what they couldn't have. But not this one. He hadn't moved at all. Something about this moment, this unnatural, quiet, unsettled Will. The script he had written in his head wasn't unfolding. By now, he should have heard the creak of a chair, the brush of fingers on wood, the faint crinkle of paper disturbed. Instead, the room remained wrapped in a stillness broken only by the steady tap of rain against the window panes and the low, ponderous ticking of the grandfather clock across the room. Will tightened his jaw, not from disappointment but from confusion. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't prepared for stillness. He hadn't imagined that a child's silence could become a kind of presence heavier than sound. And in that hesitation, for the first time in months, Will realized he was paying attention, not to the room, not to the money on the table, but to the presence of this quiet boy who had walked into his world, like a character who didn't belong to the script. A figure he hadn't planned for. A figure who, without a word, was unlocking doors Will had long ago sealed shut. Where this would lead, Will couldn't yet say. But for now, one thing was clear. Something had shifted, and he was no longer certain that he was the one in control of the story. The door had barely clicked shut behind Rachel when she stopped in the hallway, her hand still resting on the knob, as if holding on to something that might slip away if she let go. Inside her was a swell of worry. She couldn't quiet a storm that came not from fear of disobedience, but from the helpless gamble she had just made. Leaving her son alone in the library with her employer had not been a choice. It was a necessity, a move made at the edge of desperation. She had already asked for too much this morning. She knew that. Rarely did anyone allow a domestic worker to bring a child into a private home, least of all a home like Will Hawthorne's, a place as silent and immaculate as a museum, with walls that seemed to resist the presence of anything human, especially children. But this morning, when the school announced a sudden closure due to a technical issue and Rachel had no one, absolutely no one, to leave Eli with, she ran out of options. The money from this job was the only thing standing between her and a missed mortgage payment, skipped dinners, overdue utility bills, and the cold, clinical language of eviction letters. She had no parents to call, no siblings to lean on. After the accident at the construction site that took her husband's life 3 years ago, the weight of survival had landed solely on her shoulders. She had waited tables, cleaned hotel rooms, worked prep kitchens, manned overnight retail shifts, any job that was legal, and kept her close enough to Eli. But they had all been temporary, low-paid, unpredictable. No one had offered her something lasting. When Mrs. Higgins, the longtime housekeeper, mentioned a temporary fill-in role at the Hawthorne estate, Rachel had barely allowed herself to believe it. A house like that, a client like him, a job that paid well, didn't require overnights, and didn't pull her far from home. It was more than an opportunity. It was a chance, maybe her only one. But every chance came with risk. And she knew who Will Hawthorne was, or at least who people said he was. A tech billionaire with a glittering past and a reclusive present. A man known for his silence, his sharp edges, his complete intolerance for anything that disrupted his space. He didn't like children, he didn't like noise, and he certainly didn't like being asked for favors. That was why this morning, when she had gathered every ounce of courage to ask permission to bring Eli with her, Rachel had barely breathed. She had rehearsed the sentence in her head all night, chosen her words with care, softened her voice to a tone of humility. And when Will turned to look at her after she spoke, his eyes cold and unreadable, her heart nearly stopped. But then he nodded, a single silent nod. No commentary, no expression. And Rachel understood that this was not a gesture of kindness. It was a window, a sliver of possibility to prove she wouldn't be a burden. Now, with Eli sitting alone in the very room that held the tightly coiled distrust of her employer, Rachel knew that even the smallest misstep could end everything. She lowered her gaze, took a deep breath, and walked quickly toward the dining room where lunch needed preparing. But inside, her thoughts were still fixed on the library door. She trusted her son. Eli was a good boy, thoughtful, careful, too mature for his age in ways that made her ache with pride and sadness. But he was still a child, just 7 years old, sitting in a vast, unfamiliar room filled with things he'd never touched before in the company of a powerful man he didn't know. Rachel whispered a prayer, quiet and simple, not for anything grand, just that her son would be still, that he would be calm, quiet, invisible for 10 brief minutes, just long enough for her to prove she could be counted on, just long enough to hold on to this job for 1 more week, 1 more month, 1 more inch of hope. Inside the library, Will had not moved. He had not reacted. But every word Rachel had spoken to her son, every shallow, hurried breath, every cautious step she took echoed through his mind like the first scattered pieces of a puzzle whose image he could not yet see. A puzzle that perhaps would change everything he had ever believed to be true. Eli sat still just as his mother had asked, his small hands resting quietly on his lap, eyes fixed on the patterned rug beneath his feet. He tried not to breathe too loudly, not to move, not to make even the smallest sound. The room, with its towering ceilings and dark wood bookshelves stretching toward the sky, made him feel smaller than he had ever felt before. Everything about this place was different from the world he knew. In the cramped rental apartment he shared with his mother, every object was familiar, worn down by time and use. He could walk through it in the dark without bumping into a thing. But here, everything looked expensive, delicate, important. He didn't know what the armchair was made of or how old the grandfather clock in the corner might be, but he knew this much: if he broke anything, his mother would be in serious trouble. And Eli didn't want that. She was already so tired. He didn't want to be the reason she cried again. Inside his coat sleeve, Eli kept something small, something he always carried with him. It was a battered red toy car named Lightning Joe, a name he'd made up himself back when he was still in preschool. The car had only 3 wheels left. Its paint was chipped, its roof slightly cracked on one side. But to Eli, it was a treasure beyond price. It was the last toy his father ever gave him before the accident on the construction site. Eli had been too young to fully understand what it meant to lose someone forever, but not too young to feel the hole left behind. Since then, Lightning Joe had become his constant companion, the one he whispered to at night before sleep, the one he held in his pocket on days that felt uncertain. Today was one of those days. When his mother told him they were going somewhere new, a big house with a strict man in charge, Eli had quietly slipped Lightning Joe into his coat pocket without saying a word. He didn't know if he'd be allowed to play or touch anything. But with Joe nearby, he didn't feel quite so alone. He glanced at the man in the armchair just a few feet away. The man didn't look like anyone his mother had worked for before. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with neatly trimmed silver hair, dressed in a fine gray wool suit. His polished black shoes sat perfectly aligned beneath the chair, and even with his eyes closed, his face held an expression of sternness, like someone who didn't allow himself to relax even in sleep. Eli thought perhaps he was a king. Not the kind with a crown from fairy tales, but a real-world king, the kind who didn't need a throne because everyone bowed to him anyway. But then he remembered his mother had said he wasn't a king, just a rich man. Still, in Eli's eyes, being rich seemed like enough to make people afraid, and that was what saddened him most. His mother was the strongest person he knew. She could juggle 2 jobs at once, stay up all night sewing his school clothes, skip meals without ever letting him know it was because there wasn't enough. She was a warrior in her own quiet way. And yet all it took was the mention of this new employer for her eyes to fill with worry. Eli didn't understand all of it, but he understood enough to know that today he couldn't make mistakes. He had to be good. He had to be invisible. Like the stray cat he used to feed behind their apartment, always creeping gently, always alert. He tugged his coat down a little, sat up straighter, and fixed his eyes on the rug again, telling himself he wouldn't move until his mother returned. But in his pocket, Lightning Joe rested like a quiet promise, reminding him that no matter how cold or unfamiliar this place felt, there was still something he could hold on to. Something small, something old, but something that belonged entirely to him. A memory of his father, a reason to stay still, to behave, to wait. And across the room, Will Hawthorne still sat unmoving, eyes closed, breath steady, maintaining the illusion of slumber. But something unexpected was stirring within him, a sensation creeping into his chest, subtle, unfamiliar. It was not the scorn he had anticipated, not the quiet triumph of watching another person fail his test. It was something else, something harder to name. He was beginning to listen, not to judge, but to understand, something he hadn't allowed himself to do in years. Rachel returned to the library just minutes after she had stepped out. Her steps were brisk, yet carefully measured, as if she were holding back a quiet panic. In her hand, she still held the white cloth she had been using in the dining room. As the door creaked open just slightly, she paused to glance inside, her eyes scanning the room in a swift, silent check. Will Hawthorne remained motionless in his leather armchair, eyes shut, breathing slow and even, as if not a moment had passed. Eli was still in the same place, seated cross-legged on the rug, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed downward. Rachel exhaled softly, the breath of someone who had been holding far too much for far too long. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with the gentlest of touches, careful not to let it click. Crossing the room with quiet urgency, she knelt down beside her son, lowering herself until they were face to face. Eli looked up, his eyes lighting just slightly at the sight of her, but he didn't speak. He pressed his lips together, as if even a whisper might shatter everything they were trying so hard to protect. Rachel placed a hand on his small shoulder, her touch light, but filled with a quiet plea. Her voice came out as barely more than a breath. "You have to listen carefully, Eli. I have to go back to work, and I can't leave you alone for too long, but you have to promise me something." She looked into his eyes, steady and serious. "Promise me you won't touch anything in this room. Don't leave the rug. Don't get on the chair. Don't open any books. And don't go near him." She tilted her head slightly toward Will, who still appeared to be asleep. Eli nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. Rachel reached out and took his hand. It was trembling, small, warm, and trying so hard to be brave. She could feel it. He was doing everything he could to be good. "You just have to sit still," she said. "If you get bored, you can think about the stories you want to tell me tonight. Or you can play with Lightning Joe in your mind, just in your mind, okay? But don't take him out. Don't let him fall. Don't let anyone see. Do you understand?" Eli nodded again, this time with more force. Rachel tried to smile, but her eyes had begun to glisten. She brushed his hair back gently, then glanced toward the armchair. Will hadn't moved, not a twitch. She turned back to her son, and now her voice dropped lower, steadier. "If he wakes up, you can't say anything. Don't make a sound. Don't call me. Just sit still. Keep your head down. I'll be back quickly, okay?" From deep in his throat, Eli murmured, "Yes, I understand." Rachel leaned in and hugged him, brief but firm, like someone trying to pass strength through her arms into a child who already bore too much. Then she stood, adjusted his scarf with a mother's tenderness, and stepped backward toward the door. Before leaving, she spoke once more. This time her words were not instruction. They were a prayer wrapped in desperation. "If you do well, I can keep this job. We'll have dinner. We'll have warm blankets. We'll have lights. I believe in you. But I need your help more than ever before." Eli looked up at her and nodded, a small, resolute nod, the kind that carried the weight of something far too large for the shoulders of a 7-year-old. Rachel placed her hand on the doorknob, turned it slowly, and stepped out. This time she didn't look back. Inside the room, Will remained exactly as before. But within him, the stillness was gone. Every word Rachel had whispered to her son echoed in his mind like the haunting notes of a melody he couldn't forget. Each sentence carved its way through the thick armor of doubt and cynicism that had encased his heart for years. There had been no performance in her voice, no polish, no manipulation, only raw, unfiltered urgency, the kind that cannot be rehearsed, the kind that comes from living too close to the edge for too long. And suddenly Will saw the scene for what it truly was, not a test, not a trap, but a glimpse into something heartbreakingly real. For the first time, he began to understand that poverty had nothing to do with worn coats or empty pockets. In this room filled with books and old wood and silence, the truly poor man was not the mother in the faded sweater. It was him. The man with wealth too vast to spend and trust too shattered to give. Now he waited not for proof of human failure, not for confirmation of his bitter theories, but for the world to offer him perhaps one more reason to believe. And maybe, just maybe, Eli, the quiet boy with solemn eyes and a broken toy hidden in his pocket, would not become another piece of evidence for everything Will had come to fear about the world. Maybe instead, the child was here to show him something he had forgotten how to see. The soft click of the door closing behind Rachel barely made a sound, but to Will Hawthorne it echoed like the slam of a heavy gate in his mind, shutting off all distractions and sealing him inside the walls of his own test. The room fell into a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Only the rain outside remained, its rhythm steady and endless against the tall windows, each drop ticking like the hand of a relentless clock. From the fireplace came the occasional crackle as a log split under heat, but beyond that the world held its breath. Eli did not move. He remained exactly where Rachel had left him, cross-legged on the rug, hands folded neatly on his lap. His eyes lowered, tracing the strange shapes and faded whorls in the old wooden floor beneath him. The thin fabric of his coat, now damp from the walk through the rain-soaked path to the house, clung to his small frame. His knees shivered beneath it, the cold working its way in, but still he sat perfectly still. Will cracked open one eye, just barely hidden behind thick lashes and the dim, flickering glow of the wall sconce. He could see the boy clearly, not the way one inspects a subject under observation, but with a different kind of gaze, deeper. He noticed the damp hair flattened against the child's head, the frayed edges of his small shoes caked with a trace of mud. And more than anything, he noticed the stillness in the boy's face. It wasn't curiosity that kept him quiet, nor was it mischief waiting to strike. There was no fidgeting, no glancing around the room, no sideways look at the envelope perched so conspicuously on the table. Eli simply sat as if part of some silent ritual, as if shrinking himself to protect something fragile in a world too big and too breakable. Will remained motionless. He wanted to see how long it would take. How many minutes would pass before the boy's patience wore thin, before the inevitable curiosity took over, before a small hand reached forward, even if only to graze the corner of the envelope. Just a brush of fingers that was all Will needed to confirm what he had long believed, that no one, not even a child, could resist the lure of money when the chance came without consequence. But 10 minutes passed and the room was still as it had been. The only movement came from the fire's glow, and the glass trembling in its frame as wind rattled the edges of the tall windows. Will's neck had begun to ache. The long stillness was working its way into his spine, a dull pain throbbing at the base of his skull. Part of him wanted to shift, to stretch, to end the charade, but pride held him fast. He would not break the scene he had crafted, not yet. He could not let a 7-year-old undo the fortress of suspicion he had built so carefully over the years. 5 more minutes crawled by. Will could feel each tick of the grandfather clock like a needle pressing against his nerves. He had never held a test this long. Usually it took mere moments, a glance, a twitch, a subtle drift toward temptation. But Eli was different. The boy had not so much as glanced at the envelope. He had not once looked at the man asleep in the chair across the room. He had not shifted his position. He was a statue of resolve. Will's confusion deepened. What was this child waiting for? Was he frozen by fear? But no, the tremble in his knees and hands was not the stiffness of fright. It was endurance, a quiet suffering, a choice made long before Rachel had slipped from the room, a choice to do right, at any cost. A strong gust pushed against the windows, making the glass hum in its frame. A chill slid through the narrow gap in the casing, brushing across Will's face and coiling around his legs. He hadn't realized how cold the room had grown. The cashmere robe he wore did little to guard against the creeping cold. He drew one foot back slightly, then stilled himself again, resuming the posture of slumber. But in that small, instinctive motion, a new thought began to form. What if he wasn't testing the child at all? What if it was the boy who was testing him? Because if Eli didn't touch the money, if he broke none of the rules, then this was no longer an experiment in betrayal. It would become a mirror. And in that reflection, Will might see something he had spent the last decade refusing to face, a truth far more unsettling than greed, the possibility that he had been wrong, that goodness might still exist, that trust long buried could stir again. The air in the room felt thick, as if time itself had stalled. Will Hawthorne was no longer the one in control. Not of the room, not of the test, and certainly not of the quiet unraveling taking place within him. He was no longer waiting for proof of failure. He was waiting for something else entirely, something he hadn't dared to believe in for years, something simple and powerful, something that could shift the entire way a man sees the world. He was waiting to see if hope, small and quiet and wrapped in a 7-year-old boy's stillness, might be real after all. Will Hawthorne remained still in his chair, his body frozen like a statue, eyes closed in the illusion of deep sleep. Yet beneath the curtain of his lashes, his mind churned with restless intensity like an old machine roused from years of dormancy. He was waiting for the precise moment when goodness would yield to temptation. He counted the seconds, the measured breaths of the boy across from him, convinced that soon Eli would do what everyone else eventually did. That, given enough silence and the right opportunity, even a child would reach for what was not his. But what happened next was unlike anything Will had ever seen. A faint sound broke the stifling stillness of the room, barely audible, the whisper of fabric shifting. Will's senses snapped into sharp focus. He knew that sound. It wasn't footsteps, it wasn't paper, it was the quiet rustle of clothing. Someone was removing a coat. Behind his closed lids, Will pictured it Eli, perhaps too cold changing his jacket, or maybe preparing to conceal the envelope. The thought made Will's heartbeat stutter, a quick spike of adrenaline flashing through him. But then something touched him. Something soft, something damp, something impossibly gentle. It landed on his feet like a feather cool against his skin, a worn, rain-soaked fabric. He nearly startled in reflex, but he held himself still. He knew exactly what it was even before he dared to believe it. Eli's coat. The boy had removed his own coat and placed it over Will's feet. Will didn't move, didn't breathe too deeply, afraid that if he did, the weight of this moment would break. The boy said nothing, but Will could hear his soft, trembling breath steady and real. He felt the boy's small hand smooth out the corners of the coat, carefully aligning the edges. Then a voice, barely a whisper, softer than the rain outside, drifted up and struck Will like a blow to the chest. "My mom says, even grumpy people can get cold." Will nearly gasped. He had spent years crafting an impenetrable shell of caution and distance, rebuilding himself out of suspicion and control. In his world, kindness always came with strings, and every gesture was a transaction. But this child with damp hands and solemn eyes had offered him warmth without expecting anything in return. Not gratitude, not approval, not even awareness, just warmth. Will's throat tightened. He felt it rising, the thing he'd kept buried for so long. But before he could fully face it, Eli moved again. This time it was toward the table. Will didn't hear footsteps, but he could sense the movement. And then came a sound, not the rustle of paper being stolen, but the gentle scrape of an envelope being nudged back into place. Eli wasn't taking anything. He was adjusting it. The envelope had slipped, nearly fallen, and the boy had simply noticed. Will opened his eyes the tiniest amount, just enough to see. Eli's hands moved with the care of someone handling something fragile. He placed the envelope neatly in the center of the table beside the lamp. The soft glow cast golden light on the boy's damp chestnut hair, turning it the color of honey. And still the boy did not leave. He had seen something else, a small leather notebook on the floor, which had slipped from Will's hand earlier without him noticing. Eli bent to pick it up, wiped it clean with the edge of his sleeve, and placed it beside the envelope with quiet precision. Then he stepped back, retreating slowly across the room. No fanfare, no looking over his shoulder for approval. Just silent, careful restoration. As if he believed that in a world already so easily broken, the best he could do was leave things better than he found them. He sat again, curling into himself, his small arms wrapped tightly around his knees. He said nothing, didn't ask for warmth, didn't complain. And Will, even without opening his eyes again, knew why. The boy had given up the only coat he had, for a stranger. And now he was cold. But still he kept his promise. He didn't touch anything he wasn't meant to. He didn't speak out of turn. He didn't disturb the silence. Will closed his eyes again, but not to feign sleep this time. He did it to hold back the tears. They rose sharp and unexpected from a place so long ignored he'd almost forgotten it existed. In his entire life, no one had ever done something kind for him without condition. No one had ever given without calculating what they might take back. But this boy in less than 20 minutes had given him two things he had stopped believing in. Simple things, impossible things, kindness and trust. And it all began with a small, damp coat. The room returned to the same stillness it had held before, a quiet so complete it almost felt intentional. Outside, the wind continued to whistle through the worn cracks of the window panes, carrying with it a damp, biting chill that crept into every corner. But Will Hawthorne no longer noticed the cold. Something strange had settled in his chest, a fragile warmth that wrapped around his heart like a whisper, delicate yet astonishingly real. The small coat in his lap, damp and thin as parchment, now felt heavier than any wool sweater he had ever owned. It was heavy not with water, but with something far more weighty. It carried something he had long ago decided did not exist anymore. A good deed offered without reason, without expectation, without reward. Will remained motionless, eyes half closed, though his thoughts had long since drifted away from the test in front of him. Now he was listening not for signs of deception as he always had, but for something far subtler. The sound of the wind, the soft crackle of the fire, and the faint, steady breath of the boy curled in the corner of the rug. His small shoulders trembled slightly, but he made no complaint. Once again, Will opened his eyes just enough to see Eli. The boy sat with his arms wrapped around his knees, gaze fixed on the fire as if trying to draw warmth from the flames through the sheer force of imagination. Then he stirred. Will tensed instinctively, but watched as the boy rose slowly and padded toward the small table beside the chair. His steps were quiet, deliberate, as if testing whether the floor would accept his presence. He did not touch the envelope of money. Will knew that without needing to guess. The boy's eyes were not drawn to the bills, but to something else entirely, the brown leather notebook. He had picked it up earlier, but now seemed to realize it had not been returned to its proper place. Carefully, he took his sleeve and wiped the cover again, then gently nudged it into position beside the base of the lamp. Straightened it, aligned it, ensured it would not fall again. When it was done, the boy stepped back and regarded the table as if it were an antique that needed to be displayed just so. And in that quiet moment, Will heard him whisper, so soft and yet unmistakably clear. "Now it's safe." 4 simple words, but they carried the weight of an entire world. No one had asked him to do it. No one had said the envelope was at risk. No one had told him to pick up the notebook. And certainly, no one had expected a 7-year-old child to care about the order, the neatness, or the safety of a stranger's workspace. But he had, because it was the right thing to do. Because in his small world, everything had a place and everything should be in its place. There is nothing more precious than the feeling of safety. Nothing more important than making sure things are just where they belong. Will felt a lump rise in his throat. He couldn't recall the last time someone had said something so simple and yet so powerful. Now it's safe. The boy hadn't said it for praise. He wasn't speaking to anyone in particular. He wasn't looking to be noticed. He was simply putting a quiet, invisible kindness into words. Then Eli turned softer in his movements than before and made his way back to the rug, settling into the very same spot, his back lightly against the wall arm, still hugging his knees. This time he didn't shiver as much. Perhaps it was because he was closer to the fire. Perhaps it was the safety he had just created for himself. Or perhaps it was something deeper, something only children truly understand. Will closed his eyes again, not to pretend to be asleep, but to hide the tear that had just slipped from the corner of his eye. For the first time in many years, something inside him broke. Not from sorrow, from regret. He had believed there was no one left in the world who could make him stop doubting. And yet a 7-year-old boy in a paper-thin coat with a heart far too large for his small frame had done it in less than 30 minutes. Now it's safe. The words echoed in his mind, and he knew that in a life full of deceit and loss, this was the first moment in a very long time when he truly felt he could believe again. The library door creaked open with the softest groan, barely audible, but just enough for Will to know that Rachel had returned. He kept his eyes closed, body still feigning the deep stillness of sleep, but his ears perked up at once. Her footsteps, usually measured and quiet, were quicker now, laced with urgency. There was something in the rhythm of her stride that struck him with unease. She hadn't simply come back, she was panicked. Her eyes swept across the room, and for a breathless moment her heart stopped when she saw Eli still curled up in the corner of the rug. But what took her breath away completely was the sight of her son's familiar coat, now draped across Will Hawthorne's legs. The envelope of money still lay untouched on the table, neat and undisturbed, but that didn't ease her. On the contrary, it made everything worse in her eyes. Rachel froze for a moment, then rushed toward her child, her voice cracking with fear. "Eli, what did you do? Why is your coat on Mr. Hawthorne? Did you touch him? Did you touch that envelope?" Eli looked up, His cheeks were still flushed from the cold, but his eyes held no fear, only the innocent confusion of a child who did not understand what he had done wrong. He spoke softly. I just thought he looked cold, so I put my coat on him, and that paper was falling off the table, so I pushed it back. I didn't take anything. Rachel heard those words like a blade to the heart. She believed her son, but she did not believe the world would. She had seen too much, lived through too many moments when the vulnerable were crushed under the weight of mere misunderstanding. And if Will had misunderstood even one part of this moment, they would be cast out. Not just jobless, but homeless. She bent down quickly, trembling as she pulled the coat from Will's legs, her hands shaking, her voice reduced to a broken murmur of apology. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't know why he did that. I told him not to. I'm sorry. Please don't be angry. Please don't send us away." She bent lower as if she could disappear into the carpet, her breath coming fast, her hands clutching the coat like it was evidence of a crime. Eli sat beside her silent. He looked at his mother with eyes that did not understand why kindness could cause such fear. Will could feel the tremors radiating from both of them, but what stirred him most wasn't their fear itself. It was the source of it. Rachel wasn't afraid because she had done something wrong. She was afraid because she had spent too long believing she didn't have the right to do something right. Her fear was not like the kind he had seen in those who had snuck wine from his cellar. Not like the slick charm of business partners with knives behind their backs. No. Rachel's fear came from a belief that no one would ever believe her. That even if her child had done nothing wrong, the world would still find them guilty. Will heard her whisper through her sobs, "I'll do anything. I'll work without pay if I have to. Please, just don't throw us out. My son was just trying to be kind. He doesn't know the rules. He doesn't know who you are." Will still did not open his eyes, not because he was clinging to the act, but because if he did, he was afraid Rachel would see what had happened to his own eyes, the redness, the tears. He was a man who had once believed he could never cry again. A man who had thought kindness was nothing more than a sweet-sounding trap. But he no longer believed that. He had heard everything. Every trembling word, every muffled sob, every anxious footstep, and he realized that all these years he had been wrong. Not everyone was out for money. Not everyone wanted something from him. Some people just wanted to work, to live, to raise their child with dignity. Some children still knew how to care, even when they had nothing to give but a thin coat and an honest heart. And there were mothers in this world, exhausted and terrified, who would still apologize for their child's goodness simply because life had taught them that goodness was a risk. Will's hand tightened gently around the armrest of his chair. It was time to open his eyes, not just to end the act but to face himself. He didn't know if there was still time to make things right in his life, but at the very least today, he could begin. Will Hawthorne opened his eyes. He didn't sit up, didn't speak right away. He simply let his gaze rise slowly to the ceiling, where it lingered for a long, motionless moment, before drifting downward to where Rachel knelt on the floor. Her hands clenched tightly around her son's tiny coat, as if she were holding on to the last flicker of hope she had left in the world. Her hair was tangled, her cheeks streaked with tears, and her slender shoulders trembled under the weight of tension, too great for any one person to carry alone. Beside her sat Eli, silent and still, his wide eyes fixed on the unfolding scene, trying with all his small strength to understand what was happening and why a simple act of kindness had turned his mother into someone so afraid. Will looked at them the way a man might look into a shattered mirror and see the pieces of himself reflected back. Once long ago he had been the boy in the corner of the room. Once he too had watched the world of grown-ups with curious and frightened eyes. He had listened as his mother whispered desperate pleas to landlords and strangers after his father had walked out, leaving them alone in a crumbling apartment as winter crept in through cracked windows. Will had clutched his only toy, hoping something good might still find them. But nothing ever did. And over time, he stopped hoping altogether. Now, as he stared at Rachel on her knees and Eli tucked into the corner, he no longer felt like the distant observer. He was the cause, the reason. The one who had made a mother lower her head, beg with trembling breath, and plead for mercy, simply because her child had done something right. He had become everything he once despised, a man whose presence alone made others afraid, a figure of quiet threat seated atop a mountain of wealth, testing the hearts of others like it was a game. Will lowered his eyes to the coat still lying across his legs. It was damp, worn thin, the fabric frayed in places. One side of the collar was already coming undone. A A small stain along the hem told the story of a child who had likely slipped in a puddle somewhere, just another ordinary hardship. And yet this little coat meant more than anything he had ever worn, not because of what it was made of, but because of what it meant. It was an offering, a gesture without agenda, a small act of care, unasked for uncalculated. He turned to Rachel. Her eyes were red-rimmed with fear and exhaustion, yet she still met his gaze when she saw he was awake. She did not look away. She did not flee. There was only a calm, fragile determination in her stare, a quiet courage that fought to remain steady even as her hands trembled. Will took a deep breath. The damp air crept beneath the collar of his shirt and made him shiver. But the chill wasn't from the cold. It came from something deeper. A reckoning. A realization that for all these years he had pushed away every soul who might have thawed the ice within him. He had built a fortress out of suspicion and guarded it with old wounds. Now, the fortress was beginning to crack. And the one who brought it down was not a lawyer, not a business rival, not the unfaithful woman who had once worn his ring. It was a 7-year-old boy with no money, no power, only a heart still whole. Will braced his hand against the arm of the chair and slowly sat upright. Rachel instinctively pulled Eli closer, a mother's reflex born not out of rebellion but protection. Will noticed, and it hurt. Not because of her action, but because of what it revealed. He was no longer someone to be trusted. He had become the kind of man a mother had to guard her child from. I have become what I once swore I would never be. The thought slid through his chest like a cold blade. He couldn't let this moment end like this. He couldn't let the boy walk out of this house with the lesson that kindness leads to trouble. Couldn't let Rachel keep living in a world where she believed that no one would ever trust what is good. His hands curled tightly. His voice, low and rough, finally broke the silence of the room. "We need to talk." And for the first time in many years, he said those words not to close a deal, but to open something entirely new. Will stood from the chair, his movements slow and deliberate, as if each joint had to wrestle its way out from years of weight and weariness. The room was so still that the crackle of the fire in the hearth rang out like thunder. Rachel clutched her son's hand, her gaze never leaving the man who had just awakened from what they thought was sleep. Will didn't look at them right away. His eyes fell to the leather chair he had just vacated, where Eli's coat had left behind a clear wet patch, a dark spot against the otherwise pristine, polished surface. He frowned slightly, then turned back to them, and when he spoke again, his tone changed. It was the voice they had feared, sharp and cold as glass. "This chair is Italian, real leather imported from Florence. A single square inch costs more than your week's pay. Now look at it, wet, maybe ruined." Rachel's body tensed, her arms tightening around Eli. Her lips trembled. I'm sorry. I'll dry it right now. I didn't know that." "No." Will interrupted, his tone still calm but with the chill of steel. "Water leaves marks on leather. With this kind of leather drying, it won't fix it. It has to be treated. Special solution, custom made. The process alone could cost up to $500. Rachel's eyes widened. Her mouth opened slightly in protest, then closed at once. She lowered her head. Her breath grew short and rapid. Her whole body seemed to fold inward. $500 might as well have been $5,000. It was nearly a month's living. Medicine for Eli. The fragile thread that tied her to this job, this shelter, this last chance. Will stepped closer. He watched her, not just her face, but her every reaction. He was waiting. Waiting to see what she would do when cornered. Would she lash out? Would she blame the child? Would she shift fault like so many others he had known? But Rachel only whispered, "It's my fault. Please deduct it from my wages. I'll work overtime. I'll work weekends. Just don't punish my son." Will raised an eyebrow, then looked at Eli. "And you made my chair wet. How do you plan to take responsibility for that?" The boy did not turn to his mother, did not seek shelter in her arms. Instead, Eli stepped forward, one small step away from Rachel's grasp, and met Will's gaze with eyes as clear as morning. "I don't have $500, but I have this." Eli reached into his coat pocket and rummaged for a moment before pulling something out. A small toy car. Red with the paint chipped in several places. One of the wheels was missing and the front bumper had been scuffed beyond recognition, but Eli held it out with both hands gently like it was the most valuable thing he owned. "This is Lightning Joe, my dad's car. Before he went far away, he told me it was the fastest car in the world. He said whenever I felt sad, I should let it run and imagine I was flying past all the pain. Mom gave it to me so I could remember him. Eli looked up. I know your chair is really expensive, but I don't have anything else. You can keep it, if you think it's enough to make up for the chair. Will went still. A heavy silence wrapped around the room like fog, thick and unmoving. In his world, surrounded by luxury-holding objects with price tags that would make most people flinch. Nothing he owned could match the weight of what had just been offered to him. A 7-year-old child with no understanding of market value, but a profound grasp of what it meant to take responsibility. A child willing to part with the most precious thing he had, the last link to a father who was no longer here to make amends for something that wasn't even a real mistake. Rachel turned to her son, her composure unraveling in an instant as tears spilled down her face. "No, Eli, no, you don't have to do that. But Eli shook his head. "It's okay, Mom. I got the chair wet. I should fix it." Will reached out and took the tiny car, his hands trembling. Not from anger, not from cold, but from the surge of emotion flooding his chest so fiercely he could hardly breathe. The toy was battered, its red paint chipped and faded, one wheel broken, the metal dulled by time. And yet it was worth more than anything in this house, because within it lived love. Bravery, a raw, honest apology, and more than anything, something Will had not seen in a long, long time, a soul. He looked at Rachel. Her eyes met his, filled with fear and hope, but also an unshakable pride for the boy beside her. Will clenched the toy tighter in his hand. He was no longer the one passing judgment. He was the one being judged. And in that moment he knew he had already lost. A child had just taught him a lesson he had spent an entire lifetime failing to learn, a lesson about love, about kindness, and about what it truly means to give. Will stood there, Lightning Joe resting in his palm, his entire body motionless as if carved from stone. The tiny car fit easily within his grasp, but it weighed as heavily as lead. His throat tightened and his eyes never left the face of the boy standing before him. Eli didn't blink. His gaze was steady, not defiant, just certain. He had no idea his quiet choice had struck the core of a heart that believed itself long since hardened. He simply knew that when you make a mistake, you try to fix it, and that Lightning Joe, even though it was the most precious thing he had, was the right way to do that. Because as his mother had taught him, when you do something wrong, you make it right with the best of what you have. Will swallowed hard, his throat dry, his voice lost somewhere beneath years of silence. He looked at the car again. The red almost gone, the metal dull and cold, the broken wheel barely hanging on. And yet it was clean, cared for, as if every scratch was a story, every mark a memory that could never be replaced or forgotten. He sat back down in the chair, the very one he had only minutes ago regarded as a prized possession, but it no longer mattered. With a slow movement of his fingers, Will spun Lightning Joe by the one wheel that still turned, wobbling clumsily as it made its uneven circle. He thought of the past, of all the lifeless gifts he'd received from shallow connections and hollow alliances, expensive watches, gold-inlaid pens, rare bottles of whiskey wrapped in walnut boxes, but never had he received a gift like this, a gift offered not for favor, not for gain, but for responsibility, and for love. Eli spoke, his voice soft but clear. "You can keep it if you want. I know it's not as nice as a real car, but it's really fast. I called it Lightning Joe because my dad said nothing was faster, not even being sad." Will felt something seize in his throat. That simple sentence clutched his chest like a fist. He remembered dimly that he too had once owned a toy car, a long time ago, but it had been thrown away with the rest of his childhood, tossed out in a season of grief and forgetting. He lifted his eyes to Rachel. She stood quietly in the corner, tears sliding down her cheeks, saying nothing to stop her son, offering no protest, no reprimand. She had let him choose. And in doing so, she had chosen love expressed not in protection, but in trust. She believed her son could tell right from wrong. She believed he could stand up and take responsibility. That kind of teaching didn't come from elite schools or fancy books. It came from the heart, from living through pain and still choosing grace. Will looked back to Eli. The boy stood still, fists clutching the edge of his coat eyes, waiting not for forgiveness, but simply for a response. "You don't have to take it. You can be mad. You can even fire my mom, but at least I did the right thing." That was what his eyes said. And Will bowed his head, just slightly, but it held everything: gratitude, regret, recognition, the quiet admission that he, not the child, had been wrong all along. Not for sitting in a wet chair, but for closing his heart to everything good and kind for so many years. He drew a long breath. The room was still, save for the wind whispering through the windows and the soft patter of rain on the roof. Yet inside, something shifted. A wall, a layer of frost, a long settled dust. It had broken loose. "I'll keep Lightning Joe," he said quietly, his voice rough, unsteady, "but only if you agree to be my secret keeper." Eli frowned slightly, not understanding. Will continued, "I don't know how to fix all the things I've done wrong, but if you teach me little by little, I'll learn. I'll learn how to trust, how to say thank you, how to care again." A smile broke across Eli's face. He nodded, then ran to his mother and threw his arms around her. Rachel clutched him tightly, the two of them melting into one another in a tearful embrace. But now the tears were different. They were tears of release, of relief. Will turned back to the toy in his hand, but this time he looked at it differently. He placed it gently on the table right beside the leather-bound notebook where he often wrote thoughts no one ever read. Then he looked out the window. The rain was still falling, but inside the storm had begun to clear. He kept his eyes on Lightning Joe resting quietly on the table. The warm light from the desk lamp caught on the chipped red paint gleamed softly off the dented metal and the crooked wheel. In that room, after the false anger, after the constructed accusations, a different kind of silence had taken hold. Not the silence of someone waiting for another to fail, but the silence of a man finally standing still long enough to face himself, for the first time in many years. Rachel sat quietly, her arms still wrapped around Eli, as if afraid that letting go might cause him to be taken away. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, just looked at Will with eyes that held fear, uncertainty, and confusion all at once. Will didn't blame her. He knew the performance he had just given was cruel, drawn out too long, and left a bruise deeper than he intended. The air in the room no longer felt like a test. It was now a wound, a crack that had split open and bled, and now no one could pretend it wasn't there. He lowered his head and rubbed his forehead as if even he didn't know where to begin. A long moment passed before he finally spoke, his voice hoarse and low. "I owe you both an apology." The words made Rachel frown slightly, and Eli looked up, eyes wide as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just heard. Will nodded slowly, deliberately, his voice heavy, each word sounding like it was being pulled from a place deep within. "I wasn't asleep. I never was. From the very beginning, this was a test. You did nothing wrong, Rachel. Neither did your son. All morning I was testing you." He paused, his gaze locking onto the trembling woman before him. "And now I feel ashamed of myself." Rachel didn't speak. She only held Eli tighter, her tear-streaked eyes watching Will with a quiet, wounded disbelief. Will looked at Lightning Joe, then at Eli again. "This boy gave me the most valuable thing he owns. Not to beg for forgiveness, just to protect his mother. That single act made me realize that for all these years I've been living blind. A man who had everything and nothing at all. A man so afraid of betrayal he learned to see kindness as manipulation. And the truth is, I was wrong." He exhaled a breath filled with weight. "I once loved, once trusted, once dreamed, but then I was betrayed by the person I trusted most. My ex-wife took everything, my company, my name, my friends. I built it all back, but my heart never did. I came to believe that everyone was the same, that if given the chance, anyone would take whatever they could and run. But today, a 7-year-old boy made me see something different." Will turned to Eli, trying to smile, though his lips trembled. "Do you know what you did? You didn't just lay a coat over my legs. You placed something over my heart that I thought I would never feel again. Trust." Eli pressed his lips together. Rachel's tears continued to fall, but the fear had vanished from her face. In its place was something quieter, deeper, the feeling of finally being seen after so many silent, exhausted, anxious days. Will rose to his feet, then walked slowly toward the mother and child. He knelt down beside them, his knees protesting with age and pain. But he didn't care. His eyes were now level with Eli's. "I don't deserve Lightning Joe, but you gave him to me anyway. So I want to give something back, not just with words, but with something real. You've given me the greatest lesson of my life. And because of that, I'll never forget you, Eli." Rachel broke down, not from sorrow, but from something stronger. A wave of emotion rising fast and full in her chest. Eli remained quiet, but he reached out and gently placed a hand on Will's shoulder. "You don't have to know everything. Just don't be cold anymore." Will let out a laugh, soft, breath-light, but it was alive. He stood up, stretching as if he were shedding a weight he had carried for far too long. The room felt brighter, though the rain still fell outside. He looked again at the leather chair, at the notebook, at the envelope of money still sitting undisturbed on the table. Then he spoke, his voice calm and firm. Today I woke up, not because I was tricked, but because I finally touched something I thought I had lost forever. A human heart. And it's still beating, somewhere, in a boy named Eli. Will walked over to the desk where the envelope of money still sat undisturbed. He picked it up, turning it over in his hands as if it no longer held the weight it once did. Money had always been his measuring stick, the only currency he trusted to reveal people's true selves, but now it felt weightless, empty. He turned back toward Rachel and Eli, his face no longer cold, but touched with something softer, something almost grateful. "I don't just owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I want to make things right." He paused, took in a long breath, then continued. "I don't need a housekeeper anymore, but I do need a partner." Rachel furrowed her brow, uncertain. "I don't understand." Will smiled. "I want you to be the estate manager for this entire property. I need someone with responsibility, with a heart, and you have both. Not everyone can raise a child to be kind, especially under the weight of hardship, and I need Eli, this boy." He turned to Eli, his voice dipping steadier now, but filled with meaning. "You're the only one who has given me something no one else has, not in years, a chance to begin again." Rachel was speechless. She shook her head gently. "I can't take that job. I don't have experience. I've only ever cleaned floors, made beds. I don't know how to manage anything." Will stepped closer, his tone calm, his posture open. "You don't need to know it all at once. I'll teach you. I've got time. And more importantly, I have faith in you. If you say yes, everything changes." Rachel looked at Eli. The boy was silent, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes, now a flicker of light where there had been only caution before. His lips moved, barely a whisper. "We get to stay here, Mom?" That quiet question broke through everything. Rachel stopped resisting. She nodded, her eyes filled with tears. "I'll do my best." Will smiled, then turned to Eli. "And you, we have our own agreement to make, a special contract." Eli blinked. "I don't know how to sign my name yet." "That's fine." Will chuckled, the sound full and real. "This contract only needs a nod. Starting today, you'll come here after school. You can sit in the library, do your homework, read Play with Lightning Joe if you want. And most importantly, you'll be my special advisor. You'll teach me how to be a person again, like a good boy once did." Eli tilted his head, thoughtful. "I don't have to mop floors, right?" "No," Will said, grinning. "Just teach me how to smile." And in return, he added, his voice slowing, deepening. "I'll cover all your school fees, from now until college, any school you choose. All I ask is that you study hard and keep your heart just the way it is." Rachel broke down in tears, not from fear, not from sadness, but from the release of every year of exhaustion, worry, and quiet sacrifice. She couldn't speak, couldn't find the words to hold the weight of that moment, but Eli simply nodded, eyes shining. "Then I agree. Deal." Will extended his hand and Eli placed his small hand into the older man's. A handshake between two people from entirely different worlds. One a billionaire who had once lost all faith, the other a little boy with nothing to give but his goodness. That day marked more than the beginning of a new job. It was the birth of a family, one not bound by blood but held together by kindness. The mansion that had once echoed with silence, suspicion, and cold formality slowly filled with the sounds of small footsteps, quiet laughter, and life. Will was no longer alone, and Rachel no longer afraid. They had found each other not through obligation or wealth, but through a simple gesture, an old damp coat laid over the legs of a man who thought himself too frozen to ever feel warmth again. 10 years passed since the day a little boy named Eli reached out to shake the hand of a man who had forgotten how to trust. The Hawthorne estate no longer resembled the silent and distant house it once was. Sunlight now poured daily through its tall windows. The gardens were lush, carefully tended, blooming as if the heart of the house itself had been revived. Familiar sounds filled the air, the rustling of pages in the library, the light laughter of children echoing down the halls, the soft chords of piano drifting from the parlor. These sounds had become its new rhythm, its new breath. But today, there was no laughter, no music, no voice calling Uncle Will down the corridors. Today, every soul gathered in the library sat in stillness, waiting to hear the reading of the will. Will Hawthorne had passed away 3 days earlier after a long and quiet battle with cancer, one he had kept secret from nearly everyone for as long as he could bear. He died peacefully in the same Italian leather chair where a decade before he had once tested a boy's heart. A light blanket had been draped over him, and the worn leather notebook still rested on the table at his side. He passed at the age of 58 not in isolation, but in the arms of the only two people who had ever truly seen him and given him something more powerful than forgiveness. They had given him belonging. Rachel was now in her 30s, her dark hair pulled back, her eyes steady though rimmed with quiet sorrow. She sat on a sofa facing the lawyer, her hand wrapped tightly around Eli's. No longer a boy, Eli was now 17, tall and calm, his sharp gaze behind round glasses betraying a quiet intellect. He wore a deep navy suit, a shade more formal than his age called for, but fitting. Still, the unease in his expression was plain as he glanced around the room filled with strangers. Across the library sat Will's 3 biological children, 2 sons Adam and Cole and a daughter Miranda. They were impeccably dressed, the weight of wealth and expectation sewn into every detail of their appearance. But their expressions lacked grief. They weren't here for loss. They were here for what was left. The elderly lawyer Henderson opened a folder, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. According to the last will and testament of Mr. William Hawthorne, I will now read the official disposition of his estate. First, Mr. Hawthorne has maintained and assigned the previously established trust funds to his 3 biological children, Adam Cole and Miranda Hawthorne. These trusts were funded years ago and remain active at the agreed value. The 3 nodded, quickly satisfied with the confirmation. They exchanged glances, already calculating what to sell, what to keep, what to fight over. But Henderson did not close the folder. Instead, he paused, a long breath filling the silence before he continued. The remainder of the estate, including all real property, remaining business shares, personal investment accounts, the complete art collection, and all remaining liquid assets, is hereby left to a single individual, Eli Carson. The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence. For a moment, even the ticking of the old grandfather clock seemed to hesitate. Then, Adam shot up from his chair, his voice sharp with disbelief. "What, Eli? Who? He's the son of the maid." Miranda crossed her arms tightly across her chest, her voice clipped and cold. "This isn't legal. He must have been coerced. There's no way this stands." Henderson raised a hand, calm but firm. Mr. William Hawthorne left behind a handwritten letter explaining his decision. I was given explicit instruction to read it aloud in this room. He reached into the folder and withdrew an old envelope yellowed with time, the edges soft, the handwriting across its surface both simple and unmistakably deliberate. For those who never truly knew me and for the one who did. Eli remained silent. He didn't flinch. He didn't look around. He only tightened his grip around the small object in his palm. It was Lightning Joe, the battered red toy car he had once offered to Will all those years ago. He carried it with him always, not as a talisman, but as a quiet reminder that kindness was never a wasted act, no matter the setting, no matter the cost. And now, as the weight of accusation and envy filled the air around him, Eli's face stayed composed. He had nothing to defend because he understood that what was happening now was not a reward. It was a debt of the heart one Will had chosen to repay before his final breath, and it would not be Eli's voice speaking in his defense. It would be Will's. Henderson carefully opened the letter. The paper inside was crease-staged, the handwriting fluid but firm. The old man inhaled deeply, then began to read, his voice steady, his words deliberate, and each syllable carrying the weight of memory and meaning. "To my children, and to those gathered here today, if you are listening to these words, it means I'm no longer in this world. I do not know how I will be remembered, perhaps as a sharp investor, a withdrawn man, or a difficult old soul. But if you think the reason I left my estate to a boy named Eli is because I lost my mind, then you are mistaken. It was not madness. It was awakening. A late one, yes, but no less sincere. I was once a man who had everything: wealth, influence, power. But I did not have trust. I lost that long ago in the aftermath of betrayals I never saw coming. I loved your mother. I believed in her, and then she left, taking with her half of my fortune and half of my soul. After that, I stopped believing in people altogether. Everyone who came near me wanted something, a signature, a deal, a slice of something valuable. And yes, that includes you, my children. I do not say this to hurt you, but to speak plainly. I remember clearly the last time any of you embraced me. It was on my 60th birthday, and even then you came mostly to ask how the inheritance would be divided. And then on a rainy day 10 years ago, I decided to carry out a foolish little experiment. I pretended to be asleep, placed an envelope of money on the desk, and let a boy sit in the room with me. That boy was poor. His mother had just been hired as a housekeeper. No one had taught him how to behave in a mansion. No one told him that money was something you must never touch. But instead of taking the money, that boy did something I will never forget. He took off his own thin, damp coat and laid it gently over my legs. I heard him whisper that even grumpy people need to be warm. And just when I was sure he, like so many others, would give in to temptation, he simply slid the envelope back to the center of the table so it wouldn't fall to the floor. Then he picked up the notebook I had dropped and placed it back carefully, aligned and straight. After that, he returned to the rug, curled himself into the corner, and shivered in silence. That was when I realized I had just witnessed something I hadn't seen in decades. A pure heart. One that asked for nothing, expected nothing, and only knew how to give. But the story didn't end there. When the boy's mother returned and saw what she thought was a mistake, she panicked. She apologized over and over. She begged not for herself but for her child. She was afraid, not because she had done something wrong, but because she thought no one would ever believe they had done something right. And when I, in my arrogance, created some ridiculous scenario about a damaged chair, claimed it would cost $500 to repair, I fully expected to see what I had always seen in others. Finger-pointing excuses. Selfishness. But that didn't happen. The boy stepped forward. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an old toy car, broken, missing a wheel. And he said it was the most valuable thing he owned, that it used to belong to his father, and he offered it to me just so his mother wouldn't lose her job. I was speechless. A 7-year-old boy, no money, no future, no one beside him but his mother, and yet he was willing to give up the one thing in the world he still cherished just to keep someone else from being hurt. That was not pity. That was courage. That was sacrifice. That was love. From that day forward, I began to relearn how to trust. I asked them to stay. I gave Eli a place in the house, a place in my heart, and in time, a place in my work. Eli never asked for anything, but he gave me everything. He smiled at me, helped me fix the computer, reminded me to take my medicine, read books beside me. And on the nights when the pain from chemotherapy became too much, he sat at my bedside, held my hand, and never let go. I hadn't loved anyone like that since you were children. But love needs to be nurtured on both sides. I gave Eli all I had left to give, and he returned it with unwavering loyalty. So today, if any of you feel betrayed by me, please understand I never meant to hurt you. I simply had a final debt of the heart to repay. I leave this estate to Eli not because he was poor, but because he is rich. Rich in compassion, rich in kindness, rich in the very thing this world is running short of. And if any of you feel resentment, then blame me for failing to teach you what truly mattered early enough. Thank you for coming. And if you can let that boy continue writing the story I did not have time to finish. Because he gave me something that money could never buy, a soul. The lawyer stopped reading. The room remained still as if time had decided to hold its breath. Miranda lowered her head. Cole exhaled long and quiet. Adam sat unmoving, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. Rachel stood. Slowly, walked to where Eli sat and wrapped her arms around him. Eli looked down at his hand. Lightning Joe was still there, but now the car was no longer broken. One wheel had been carefully repaired, replaced with a small shining piece made of pure gold. He smiled softly, eyes red with tears, and whispered the same words he had spoken once before long ago. Now it's safe. After the reading of the will, the world stirred with noise. Headlines blazed, "Boy inherits billion-dollar empire from housekeeper's son to heir of Hawthorne fortune kindness that changed a destiny." But Eli said nothing. He refused interviews, declined the lavish invitations from corporate giants, hoping to turn his story into a spectacle. In the days following the funeral, Eli remained at the old mansion, drifting quietly from room to room, his fingertips brushing the familiar corners of furniture, picture frames and shelves, searching not for treasure but for memory, for traces of the man who had given him more than wealth, a chance, a place, a name that meant something more than inheritance. Rachel stayed not as the manager now, but as a mother, a companion, the only one who truly understood that Eli never wanted to be a billionaire by the world's definition. He didn't buy fast cars or sprawling estates. Instead, he and Rachel spent hours each day in Will's library, poring over the notes he had left behind, reading the books he had bookmarked, even reopening the charity files that had been abandoned when Will's illness began to overtake him. Eli wasn't chasing legacy. He was listening for a voice that had once told him through action more than words that even a small kindness could thaw a heart frozen for decades. And now, in the quiet spaces of that old mansion, he was learning how to carry that voice forward. Not with grandeur, but with purpose. A few months later, Eli announced the founding of the Hawthorne Foundation for Education and Humanity, redirecting all profits from the original conglomerate into community-based initiatives. He funded scholarships for orphans, built schools in rural areas, established libraries in underserved regions, and developed life skills training programs for youth. He didn't sit in a polished office behind layers of glass. Instead, he showed up on-site wearing a hard hat, kneeling beside children, listening to their stories, their dreams, their small but earnest hopes. Eli never forgot where he came from. Wherever he went, he carried Lightning Joe. It rested on the corner of his desk in his modest new office next to a small photograph 7-year-old Eli and Will, seated together in a library chair, a book open between them. When someone asked about the weathered toy car, Eli would simply smile and say, "That was the first lesson I ever learned about kindness, and it's the reason I'm here today." At first, the financial world was skeptical. They assumed the 17-year-old boy was a figurehead propped up by a hidden team of seasoned advisors. But project by project, investment by investment, decision after thoughtful decision, Eli proved them wrong. He preserved the integrity of the Hawthorne legacy while expanding it into something far more human. Each new branch, each new social initiative was evidence that he wasn't a puppet. He was a steward, not only of an estate, but of a philosophy, a quiet, resilient worldview born from the heart of a man who once lost everything and was redeemed by a damp coat and a 3-wheeled toy car. On his 18th birthday, Eli did not throw the gala the world expected. Instead, he invited 20 children from the slums, children sponsored by the foundation, to the Hawthorne estate. He planted trees with them in the garden. Will, once loved, showed them how to steep English tea just as Will had taught him, and together they wrote a simple vow. Each of us will carry kindness one step farther. Eli never called himself a billionaire. He said only that he was someone lucky enough to receive back what had once been lost. And that gift didn't come from money. It came from love, from a mother who never gave up, from a man who finally remembered how to care, and from a little boy who once believed that saving his mother's job was all that mattered. Today, in the city where Eli lives, there stands a school bearing the name Will Hawthorne. Over its gate, a bronze plaque is engraved with the words, "Knowledge helps us rise, but kindness keeps us together." Every student there, regardless of wealth or background, knows the story of a boy named Eli who once placed a tiny coat over the legs of a stranger. And from that small act, not only his life changed, but the world around him quietly shifted too, all because of a moment no one imagined could hold such power. Inside the top-floor office of the Hawthorne Foundation for Education and Humanity, morning sunlight filtered through the wide glass panels, casting soft, slanting rays across a dark walnut desk aged by time and memory. There wasn't much on the desk, just a small framed photo, a modest potted plant, and one object that had followed Eli through every chapter of his journey, the 3-wheeled toy car named Lightning Joe. Each morning before beginning his work, Eli paused for a moment to look at it, not because of its material worth, but for the quiet reminder it carried that every great thing begins with a simple choice. The choice to place a damp coat over the legs of a stranger. The decision not to touch the envelope of money lying in plain sight. The unnoticed act of lifting a fallen notebook and placing it back where it belonged. From those quiet moments, that once poor boy had written an entire legacy. Not a legacy measured in money or stock, but in compassion, in trust in the healing power of kindness. Eli never sought to be a symbol. He simply tried to live up to what Will had once seen in him, that rare kind of heart that gives without expecting. The story of Eli Carson is not a tale of wealth or sudden fortune. It is the story of a quiet soul who dared to remain kind in a world full of temptation. And when the world handed everything back to him, he used it not to build walls, but to open doors. Dear friends, today's story might leave us quiet for a while, not because of the surprise of inheritance, but because of the weight of a lesson so profoundly simple. Sometimes a small act of kindness, a sincere glance, or a gesture made without agenda can shift not just a life, but an entire generation. Do you feel that too? Have you ever lived through a moment where a small act made you rethink the world around you? If so, we would love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. We truly hope to hear something real from your heart. And if this story meant something to you, please click like, subscribe to our channel, and share this video so that the message of kindness can travel further, reaching those who need it most. Here at Emotional Echoes, we are dedicated to bringing you stories that touch the heart, awaken something quiet and beautiful in your spirit, and remind you that even in the noise of life, gentleness still matters. What do you think of Eli, of Will, of Rachel? Do you believe, as we do, that kindness is never lost? It only waits for the right moment to become someone's light. We hope that after listening to this story, you'll look back at the small things you've done and realize that those are the strongest foundation you'll ever build for a happy and meaningful life. Thank you for staying with Emotional Echoes on this deeply human journey. We wish you good health, daily joy, and a peaceful heart in this ever-changing world. Until next time, be well, stay kind, and keep the light going.